Welcome to my channel, States of History. And today's story is one that will stay with you long after you hear it. It begins inside a cold, bright operating room where life and death hung by a thread. A Navy SEAL, torn apart by shrapnel, lay unconscious on the table. His blood pooled beneath him, his pulse weak, slipping away by the second. The surgeons fought to keep him alive, their voices sharp and urgent. The chief surgeon barked an order, his frustration cutting through the room. Clamp, suction, move faster. We're losing him. But then his eyes fell on a quiet figure standing beside him, a young nurse. Her face calm, her hands steady, her presence almost unshaken by the storm around her. He dismissed her in a single sentence. "You're only a nurse. Stay out of the way." The operating room at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center hummed, with controlled chaos. Overhead lights blazed down on the steel table where Justice Reed lay dying. The Navy SEAL had taken shrapnel across his torso during a close air support gone wrong in Syria. Metal fragments had torn through tissue, nicked arteries, and lodged near vital organs. His tactical vest had saved his life once. Now it was up to the surgical team to do it again. Dr. Morgan Rivera stood at the head of the table, his surgical mask tight across his face, his eyes sharp and commanding. He was a trauma surgeon with 15 years of experience, a man who had seen the worst injuries war could create. His reputation was built on confidence, precision, and an unshakable belief in his own judgment. Around him, the surgical team moved with practiced efficiency. Nurses handed instruments, anesthesiologists monitored vitals, and residents watched and learned. But Rivera's attention kept drifting to one person. Parker Wu stood at the periphery of the action, her dark eyes tracking every movement, her hands ready but still. She was 28, small in stature, with black hair pulled back tight and an expression that gave nothing away. To Rivera, she was just another nurse, competent perhaps, but unremarkable. He had worked with dozens like her, or so he thought. Justice Reed's vitals dipped again. The heart monitor's beeping slowed, each tone stretching longer than the last. His blood pressure dropped into dangerous territory. Rivera's jaw clenched as he worked to clamp a bleeder, his fingers moving fast, but not fast enough. "Suction," he snapped. "More suction. We need to clear this field." A nurse complied, but the blood kept coming, obscuring his view. Rivera's frustration mounted. This was taking too long. They were losing ground. He glanced at Parker again. She had moved slightly closer, her gaze fixed on the patient's abdomen, her body language suggesting she wanted to say something. Rivera's patience snapped. "I said stay out of the way," he told her, his voice edged with irritation. "You're only a nurse. Let the surgeons handle this." Parker's eyes met his for a brief moment, something unreadable passing through them. Then she stepped back without a word, her hands folding at her sides. But she didn't look away from the patient. The seconds ticked past like hours. Justice Reed's pulse weakened further, the monitor's alarm cutting through the room's tension. Rivera's hands moved faster, trying to isolate the source of the bleeding, trying to stabilize what was rapidly becoming unstable. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Around him, the team worked in synchronized urgency, but the patient's condition continued to slide. Then, barely audible over the machines and voices, Justice Reed's lips moved. His eyes fluttered half open, clouded with pain and morphine, but focused enough to see. His gaze found Parker Wu across the room, and his mouth formed words that only she could hear first. "You have no idea who she is." The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. "You have no idea who she is." Justice Reed's voice was cracked, raw, barely more than a whisper, but every person in that operating room heard it. The syllables cut through the mechanical beeping, through the urgent commands, through the controlled chaos of a trauma surgery going wrong. Dr. Morgan Rivera's hands froze mid-motion, his fingers still gripping surgical clamps over an exposed artery. He looked down at his patient, then across the table at Parker Wu, confusion crossing his features behind the surgical mask. "What did he just say?" Rivera asked, his voice sharp with both irritation and uncertainty. The anesthesiologist, Phoenix Grant, checked the monitors and frowned. He's barely conscious, doctor. The morphine levels shouldn't allow for coherent speech. But Justice Reed's lips were moving again, his eyes struggling to focus through the haze of pain and medication. His gaze found Parker once more, and this time his voice carried farther, reaching every corner of the operating room with unexpected clarity and force. "Phantom," he said. The single word landed like a grenade. Phantom. It was a call sign, unmistakable in its military specificity. Not a name, not a plea, not a prayer. A call sign that belonged to whispered stories told late at night in forward operating bases, in ready rooms, in the quiet spaces where soldiers shared legends they half believed. The surgical team exchanged glances, uncertainty rippling through their professional composure. Rivera's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to make sense of what he was hearing. Parker Wu's expression shifted for the first time since the surgery began. Her dark eyes glistened, catching the harsh operating room lights, but her focus never wavered from the patient. She took one measured step forward, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her hands, which had been still at her sides, rose with practiced precision. She pressed them against Justice Reed's wound with exact force, applying pressure at angles that spoke of intimate knowledge, of muscle memory earned through repetition under fire. "Increase the norepinephrine drip," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Tilt the table 15 degrees, head down. We're losing perfusion to the brain." Her words were not suggestions. They were orders, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had made life and death decisions in environments far more chaotic than this sterile room. The anesthesiologist hesitated for only a second before complying, adjusting the medication flow. A nurse moved to change the table angle. Rivera stared at her, his surgical training warring with his pride. "Who do you think you are to?" he began, but Parker cut him off with a look that carried weight he couldn't quite identify. "With respect, doctor, your patient is crashing, and we have about 90 seconds before his brain starts dying. Follow my lead or watch him slip away. The choice is yours." Her tone was not aggressive, not defensive, simply factual. A statement of reality delivered by someone who had seen this exact scenario play out too many times to count. The heart monitor's alarm shrieked as Justice Reed's pulse dropped dangerously low. Rivera's pride collided with the undeniable truth that his patient was dying despite his best efforts. He looked at Parker Wu, really looked at her for the first time, and saw something in her eyes that didn't belong in a nurse barely past her 20s. He saw combat, loss, decisions made under impossible pressure, and the cold certainty of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen next. "Do it," Rivera said, stepping back slightly. Parker moved into the space he created, her hands never leaving the wound's site. "Avery, I need you on suction here," she directed the scrub nurse, pointing to a specific location. "Finley, have 2 units of O-negative standing by. Phoenix, watch his pressure and be ready to push fluids on my mark." Her commands flowed with the practiced rhythm of someone who had orchestrated trauma care in places where hesitation meant death. The team responded, not because she outranked them, but because her confidence was absolute and contagious. Rivera watched, his hands still poised over the surgical field, as Parker guided them through a sequence of interventions he hadn't considered. She wasn't just assisting. She was leading, orchestrating, commanding without demanding. And impossibly, Justice Reed's vitals began to stabilize. Hours bled into each other inside the operating room at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. Time lost its normal structure, measured only by the rhythm of heart monitors, the hiss of ventilators, and the controlled urgency in voices calling for instruments and medication. Sweat beaded on foreheads despite the room's cool temperature. Surgical gloves tore under the strain of constant motion and were replaced without pause. Blood transfusions arrived in rapid succession, bags of O-negative flowing into Justice Reed's depleted system as fast as his body could accept them. Parker Wu stood at the center of the controlled storm, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had performed these exact motions in far worse conditions. She worked the wound site with an intimacy that spoke of deep anatomical knowledge combined with battlefield experience. Her fingers found bleeders by feel as much as by sight, clamping and cauterizing with efficiency that bordered on prescient. Dr. Morgan Rivera watched her hands, watched the way she anticipated the next complication before monitors could sound their warnings, watched as she guided his entire surgical team through crisis points he hadn't seen coming. The patient's vitals crashed again. The flatline alarm screamed its warning, and Rivera's stomach dropped. Justice Reed's heart had stopped, overwhelmed by blood loss and trauma. Code Blue, Phoenix Grant called out, hands already moving to push emergency medications. Parker's response was immediate and absolute. "Start compressions," she commanded, her voice cutting through panic with surgical precision. "Avery, take over here. Finley, charge the defibrillator to 200 joules. Dr. Rivera, I need you on the airway." Rivera moved without thinking, his body responding to the authority in her tone before his mind could process the role reversal happening in his own operating room. He positioned himself at Justice Reed's head, checking the endotracheal tube placement while Parker took over chest compressions. Her hands locked together over the SEAL's sternum, pressing down with controlled force, counting silently, 30 compressions followed by a brief pause for ventilation. The rhythm was perfect, textbook, but executed with the confidence of someone who had brought people back from the edge more times than she could count. "Charged and ready," Finley announced, holding the defibrillator paddles. "Clear," Parker said, stepping back as electricity jolted through Justice Reed's body. His torso arched off the table, muscles contracting involuntarily, then collapsed back. The monitor showed chaotic activity, but no organized rhythm. "Resume compressions," Parker ordered, her hands returning to his chest without hesitation. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," she told Phoenix. "Stand by for another shock at 300 joules." The team moved in synchronization, following her lead as naturally as if she had always been their commander. Rivera found himself taking orders from a nurse half his surgical experience, and the strangest part was that it felt right. Her decisions were sound, her timing impeccable, her knowledge vast and immediate. She wasn't guessing or improvising. She was executing a protocol she had internalized so deeply it had become instinct. "Clear," Parker called again. Another shock, another arrhythmic spasm, another return to compressions. "Epinephrine in," Phoenix reported. "Calcium chloride ready if needed." Parker's eyes never left the monitor, reading the electrical patterns of Justice Reed's dying heart, watching for the moment when chemistry and electricity might restart the engine of life. Her compressions continued, steady and relentless, refusing to accept failure. Then, impossibly, a blip appeared on the monitor. A single organized beat, weak but present. Another followed, then another. "Come on," Parker whispered, her first words that weren't clinical commands. "You don't get to die today. Not on my watch." Justice Reed's heart found its rhythm again, fragile and tentative, but beating. The monitor settled into a pattern that resembled life more than death. Parker held compressions for 3 more cycles, ensuring the rhythm would hold, then slowly stepped back. "His pressure is rising," Phoenix announced, relief evident in his voice. 80 over 50, 60 over 40 on the next reading. Rivera watched the numbers climb, watched Parker's shoulders remain tense despite the apparent success, watched as she moved back to the surgical field with hands that showed no tremor despite the physical exertion of compressions. "Check for new bleeding sites," she directed. "That much epinephrine can unmask injuries we sealed earlier." Her prediction proved accurate 30 seconds later when fresh blood welled up from a vessel they thought was controlled. The surgery continued through the early morning hours. Dawn began painting the windows outside with gray light, but inside the operating room, time remained frozen in the eternal now of trauma care. Parker guided them through complication after complication, each one met with calm expertise that defied her apparent rank and age. The operating room exhaled. It was a collective release, a loosening of tension that had wound tight through muscles and minds for hours of unrelenting crisis. Nurses leaned against sterile walls, their legs shaking from sustained adrenaline and physical strain. Surgical residents slumped in corners, faces pale beneath masks now pulled down to chins. Phoenix Grant sat heavily on a stool, his eyes closed, breathing deeply as the weight of what they had just survived settled onto his shoulders. The machine surrounding Justice Reed beeped with steady, reliable rhythm now. His vitals had stabilized into ranges that promised survival rather than imminent death. Dr. Morgan Rivera pulled off his surgical gloves with deliberate slowness, each finger peeling away latex that had become a second skin over the long night. His hands trembled, a fine shake he tried to hide, but couldn't quite control. Sweat had soaked through his surgical cap, and exhaustion pressed against him like a physical weight. But stronger than the fatigue was something else, a profound disquiet that had nothing to do with the patient and everything to do with the woman standing across the table from him. Parker Wu moved through post-surgical protocols with the same calm efficiency she had displayed throughout the crisis. She documented medication dosages, checked drain placements, verified that every instrument was accounted for. Her movements were precise, professional, betraying no hint of the extraordinary performance she had just delivered. To anyone watching who hadn't witnessed the surgery itself, she appeared to be exactly what her uniform suggested. Just a nurse completing routine tasks. Rivera couldn't stop staring at her. Justice Reed was alive against odds that had seemed insurmountable. 8 hours of surgery, multiple cardiac arrests, blood loss that should have been fatal, complications that would have killed most patients twice over. And they had pulled him through, not because of Rivera's expertise, but because a nurse whose name he barely knew had taken command of his operating room and guided them through hell with the confidence of someone who had walked that path many times before. "Who are you?" Rivera asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and confusion. The question hung in the antiseptic air, drawing the attention of everyone still in the room. Parker paused in her documentation, her pen hovering over the surgical report. She looked up slowly, meeting Rivera's gaze with those dark eyes that had tracked every moment of the surgery with unwavering focus. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Rivera wondered if she would answer at all. "I'm just a nurse," Parker said finally, her voice quiet but clear. She set down her pen and began removing her surgical gown, the movements unhurried and methodical. Just a nurse doing her job. But Rivera shook his head, taking a step closer. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion and the harder lines of realization. "No," he said firmly. "No, you're not just anything. What you did in here tonight goes far beyond nursing. The calls you made, the procedures you knew, the way you commanded this room. That wasn't nursing. That was combat medicine at the highest level." Parker's hand stilled for just a moment, a barely perceptible pause that most would have missed. But Rivera was watching her closely now, seeing details he had dismissed before. The way she held herself with a stillness that spoke of military bearing. The economy of her movements, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. The scars on her forearms, faint but visible, the kind that came from operating in austere environments where sterile technique was a luxury and survival was the only metric that mattered. Avery Mason stepped forward, her voice hesitant. "The SEAL called you Phantom. That's not a name. That's a call sign." Parker met Avery's gaze, but offered no confirmation or denial. "Call signs are earned in combat," Finley Ross added, his tone carrying a mix of curiosity and respect. "Usually for something extraordinary." Parker pulled off her surgical cap, releasing black hair that had been constrained for hours. Strands fell across her forehead, and she pushed them back with hands that finally showed a slight tremor, the first crack in her composed exterior. "The patient is stable," Parker said, deflecting rather than answering. "He'll need close monitoring in the ICU for the next 48 hours. Watch for delayed bleeding, infection, and cardiac complications." She moved toward the door, clearly intending to leave, but Rivera moved to intercept her path. Not hostilely, but with the determination of someone who needed answers. "Staff Sergeant Wu," he said, using a rank he had heard Justice Reed murmur during one of his semi-conscious moments. "Or is it Sergeant First Class? Maybe something else entirely?" Parker stopped, her back to him for a moment. When she turned, her expression had shifted subtly. The mask of the compliant nurse had fallen away, replaced by something harder and more complex. "What matters, Dr. Rivera, is that Justice Reed is alive. He has a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him in North Carolina. He's missed 3 birthdays and 4 anniversaries because of deployments. Today was supposed to be just another mission, just another day at war. But he gets to go home now. That's what matters." Her voice carried layers of meaning, speaking to experiences Rivera could only imagine. Rivera studied her face, seeing past the youth to something ancient in her eyes. "How many?" he asked softly. "How many times have you done this? How many lives have you saved in places where there were no operating rooms, no backup, no margin for error?" Parker held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Enough to know that pride kills people, Doctor. Enough to know that when someone is dying, it doesn't matter who saves them or what rank they hold. It only matters that they survive." The story shifted backward through time, peeling away years like layers of scar tissue to reveal the wounds beneath. Parker Wu at 22 looked different from the woman standing in that operating room. Younger, certainly, but more than that. Less guarded, less weighted by the accumulated burden of decisions made under fire. She stood in desert camouflage utilities at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, her hair shorter then, her face unlined by the stress that would come later. Around her, other combat medic trainees moved through final preparations before deployment, their nervous energy filling the air with anticipation and fear. She had no illusions about what lay ahead. The instructors had been clear, brutally honest about the realities of combat medicine. Women in her role were still relatively rare, still viewed with skepticism by some, still required to prove themselves twice as hard to earn half the recognition. Parker had heard the whispers, felt the doubtful glances, understood that she would be tested in ways her male counterparts would not. But she also understood something deeper and more fundamental. When bullets started flying and blood started spilling, gender became irrelevant. In those moments, rank and pride and prejudice all dissolved into a single question. Can you save lives, or can't you? Her first deployment sent her to Afghanistan's Khyber province, a region of steep valleys and hostile villages where coalition forces fought an enemy that knew the terrain better than any map could show. Parker arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix in late spring, assigned to a quick reaction force that responded to troops in contact throughout the region. The base was austere, a collection of plywood structures and HESCO barriers carved into a mountainside, surrounded by wire and watched constantly by soldiers who understood they were guests in a land that did not want them. She had been there 3 weeks when a call came. A supply convoy moving through the valley had triggered an ambush, a coordinated attack with small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised explosive devices. The radio traffic was chaotic, voices overlapping, reporting casualties, calling for medevac, requesting immediate support. The quick reaction force mobilized in minutes, vehicles racing down the mountain road toward the sound of gunfire that echoed through the valley like thunder. Parker rode in the third vehicle, her aid bag clutched between her knees, her mind running through protocols and procedures, preparing herself for what she would find. The radio crackled with updates. Multiple casualties, some critical. Vehicle destroyed. Soldiers pinned down by machine gun fire from elevated positions. Medevac helicopters inbound, but weather closing in, time window shrinking. They needed help now, not in 20 minutes or 30. They needed someone willing to run into chaos while everyone else wanted to run away. The convoy stopped 200 meters short of the ambush site, taking cover behind a ridgeline that provided defilade from enemy fire. Parker could see smoke rising ahead, could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles and the deeper boom of RPG launches. The quick reaction force commander, a captain she barely knew, assessed the situation with grim efficiency. We can't get vehicles closer without exposing them to RPG fire, he said. We need to move dismounted to reach the casualties. Who's going with me? Parker was already moving, slinging her aid bag over her shoulder, checking her sidearm, her movements automatic. I'm going, she said simply. The captain looked at her, this 22-year-old medic who had never seen direct combat, and something passed across his face. Doubt, concern, maybe respect for her willingness. Woo, if we go out there, we're going to be taking fire. Heavy fire. This isn't training. People are trying to kill us. I understand, sir, Parker replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. But people are also dying. That's why I'm here. They moved forward with a security element, 8 soldiers and 1 medic advancing through rocky terrain toward the sound of battle. Bullets snapped overhead, kicking up dust and rock fragments around their feet. Parker kept moving, her body low, her focus absolute. Fear was present but compartmentalized, locked away in a part of her mind she couldn't afford to access. The only thing that mattered was reaching the wounded before they bled out. The convoy site was carnage. The lead vehicle had taken a direct hit from an RPG, its hull torn open, metal twisted and scorched. 2 soldiers lay nearby, dragged from the wreckage by their teammates, but bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds. Another soldier was down behind a boulder, his leg shredded by fragments, a tourniquet already applied but blood still seeping through. More wounded were scattered across the kill zone, some mobile, some not, all pinned down by sustained fire from enemy positions in the hills above. Medic up, someone shouted, and Parker sprinted the final 20 meters in a crouch, bullets cracking past her head, her aid bag bouncing against her side. She slid into cover beside the first casualty, a sergeant with a sucking chest wound, air bubbling through torn tissue with each labored breath. His eyes found hers, wide with pain and fear, silently asking the question every wounded soldier asks their medic. Am I going to die? Not today, Parker told him, her hands already moving, sealing the chest wound with an occlusive dressing, establishing in 4-line, pushing fluids and pain medication. Her training took over, muscle memory guiding fingers that didn't shake despite the chaos surrounding her. She moved from patient to patient, triaging injuries, prioritizing treatment, directing the security element to help move casualties to better cover. The battle continued around Parker Wu as she worked. Her world narrowed to the immediate needs of broken bodies and failing systems. Supplies ran low within the first 30 minutes. Combat gauze depleted. Hemostatic dressings used up faster than she could requisition replacements from the quick reaction force vehicles still positioned behind the ridgeline. She improvised with whatever materials were available, tearing strips from uniforms, using duct tape to secure bandages, fashioning splints from rifle stocks and paracord. Her hands moved with growing confidence, each successful intervention building the foundation for the next. Air support had been promised, but weather conditions in the valley deteriorated rapidly. Low clouds obscured the hilltops, where enemy fighters maintained their positions, making close air strikes impossible without risking friendly casualties. The medevac helicopters circled at a distance, their pilots frustrated by conditions that prevented them from landing in the hot zone. The wounded would have to be stabilized and moved to a safer extraction point, which meant Parker had to keep them alive long enough to make that journey possible. When hope began to fade, when soldiers started looking at each other with the quiet resignation of men who understood they might not survive the day, Parker's voice cut through the despair. Listen to me, she called out, projecting over the gunfire with surprising force. Every one of you is going home. I don't care how bad it looks right now. You're all going home. Keep fighting, keep breathing, keep moving. We're getting out of here together. Her words carried conviction that defied their circumstances, a certainty that infected the soldiers around her with renewed determination. A young private with a mangled arm looked at her through tears of pain and fear. How can you be so sure? He asked, his voice breaking. Because I refuse to lose anyone today, Parker answered, her hands working to secure his shattered limb. Because you have people waiting for you, and I'm not going to be the one who tells them you didn't make it. So you're going to stay conscious, stay focused, and help me keep you alive. Understand? The private nodded, drawing strength from her absolute confidence even as his own body threatened to betray him. That night became legend among the soldiers who survived it. Parker Wu treated 14 casualties under sustained fire, moving between positions with complete disregard for her own safety. When the security element ran low on ammunition, she distributed magazines from the wounded who could no longer fight. When communication with headquarters faltered, she coordinated casualty evacuation priorities, ensuring the most critical patients reached the medevac birds first. When a soldier began to slip into traumatic shock, his vital signs crashing despite her interventions, she talked him back from the edge with a combination of medical expertise and sheer force of will. The enemy fire eventually slackened as coalition reinforcements arrived, pushing the attackers back into the hills. The medevac helicopters swooped in low, rotors beating the air into dust storms, loading wounded soldiers who moments before had been certain they would die in that valley. Parker rode out on the last bird, sitting among the casualties she had saved, her uniform soaked with blood that wasn't her own, her aid bag empty of everything except determination. Back at FOB Phoenix, as the wounded were transferred to the base medical facility for further treatment, soldiers began speaking her name with a reverence usually reserved for the dead. The captain who had led the quick reaction force pulled her aside, his face serious beneath layers of dust and dried sweat. "Wu, what you did out there today was extraordinary. You saved lives that should have been lost. You held that line when everyone else was ready to break. That's not just good medicine. That's heroism." Parker shook her head, exhausted beyond measure, but still standing. "I was just doing my job, sir." The captain smiled, a tired expression that acknowledged the inadequacy of words. "No, you were doing something more. The men are already talking about you. They're saying you moved like a phantom through that battlefield, appearing wherever you were needed most, impossible to pin down, impossible to stop." Parker looked at him, not understanding yet what he was telling her. That night, in the plywood structure that served as the base command post, soldiers gathered to debrief the ambush. When Parker's actions came up in discussion, someone used the word that would follow her through the rest of her military career. She was like a phantom out there, a staff sergeant said, his voice carrying the weight of witnessed truth, moving through enemy fire like it couldn't touch her, saving lives in places where death seemed certain. We couldn't see where she'd go next, but wherever the worst casualties were, she'd appear. Like a ghost, but real. Solid. Keeping us alive when we should have been dead. The name stuck immediately, adopted by consensus rather than assignment. Phantom. Not because she was invisible, but because she operated with a presence that defied conventional understanding. Because enemy fighters kept dying without ever stopping her. Because wounded soldiers kept surviving against impossible odds when she was near. Word spread through military channels the way legends always do, passed from unit to unit, embellished slightly, but rooted in verified truth. Combat medic Parker Wu became Staff Sergeant Phantom, the 22-year-old who ran into ambush sites while everyone else sought cover, who treated casualties under fire without hesitation, who brought soldiers back from the edge of death through skill and sheer determination. Some found the call sign strange at first, questioning whether it fit. But to the men whose lives she had saved, to the soldiers who had watched her work miracles in the valley that day, it was the only name that made sense. Years accumulated like layers of sediment, each deployment adding weight and depth to Parker Wu's experience. The missions became classified, buried in files stamped with clearances most soldiers would never achieve. She moved through theaters of war that existed only in redacted reports and whispered briefings. Afghanistan gave way to Iraq, Iraq to Syria, Syria to operations in places she could never name, supporting units whose very existence was denied by official channels. She carried her wounded brothers and sisters through deserts where heat reached lethal levels, through jungles where disease killed as efficiently as bullets, through cities torn apart by sectarian violence where civilians and combatants blurred into an indistinguishable mass of suffering. The work changed her in ways both visible and hidden. Scars accumulated on her hands and forearms, some from shrapnel, others from the hazards of working in austere environments where sterile technique was aspirational rather than achievable. Her eyes developed the thousand-yard stare common to combat veterans, that distant focus that comes from seeing too much death, too much pain, too many moments where skill and luck were the only things standing between life and extinction. But beneath the surface changes, something fundamental remained constant. She never asked for recognition. She never demanded respect. She simply served. Each mission followed its own rhythm, its own arc from insertion to extraction, from crisis to resolution or failure. Parker treated gunshot wounds in the backs of helicopters vibrating so hard that starting in four-line required hands steadier than most surgeons possessed. She performed emergency surgical procedures in blown-out buildings, while mortars impacted close enough to shower her with concrete dust. She held pressure on severed arteries for hours during long evacuations, her arms cramping but never relaxing, because loosening her grip meant death for the soldier beneath her hands. The missions blurred together over time, individual faces and names fading into a collective memory of wounded warriors who depended on her skill. But some moments burned themselves into permanent recall. The Special Forces operator who took a round through the femoral artery during a village raid and should have bled out in 90 seconds, but survived because Parker happened to be attached to his team that night. The helicopter pilot who crashed in hostile territory with both legs shattered and a punctured lung, kept alive through a 6-hour overland evacuation that became legend in aviation circles. The Marine who stepped on an IED that should have killed him instantly, but lived because Parker's hands were fast enough, sure enough, skilled enough to stop the bleeding before his body gave up. Her reputation grew despite her deliberate efforts to remain invisible. Commanders requested her, by name, for high-risk operations. Soldiers felt safer knowing Phantom was part of their medical support. The call sign that had started as a description of how she moved through combat evolved into something more, a promise that death could be cheated, that wounds considered fatal might be survived, that someone was watching over them with skills that bordered on supernatural. Parker knew the truth was far more mundane. She was just highly trained, deeply experienced, and completely committed to the singular purpose of keeping people alive. But legends don't thrive on mundane explanations, and soldiers needed to believe in something beyond themselves. She never spoke of her experiences outside operational debriefs. When other soldiers gathered to swap war stories, to process trauma through shared narrative, Parker remained quiet. Her silence wasn't born from arrogance or emotional distance, but from a deep understanding that some experiences couldn't be adequately communicated to those who hadn't lived them. How could she explain the weight of holding someone's life in your hands during a firefight? How could she describe the specific sound a chest wound makes when air escapes through torn tissue? How could she convey the absolute loneliness of being the only medical asset available when multiple casualties need immediate intervention and you have to choose who gets treated first, knowing your decision determines who lives and who dies? The years of deployments took their toll in ways that didn't show on medical evaluations or fitness reports. Sleep became difficult, her mind refusing to shut down completely, always maintaining a low-level alertness born from too many nights where mortars could impact without warning. Relationships outside the military community became nearly impossible to maintain, the gap between her experiences and civilian life growing too wide to bridge with casual conversation. Trust became complicated, extended easily to those who had proven themselves under fire, but withheld from those who hadn't faced the same crucible. Eventually, her enlistment term reached completion. The military offered incentives for her to re-enlist, promising rank advancement, choice of duty station, access to advanced training programs. Her commanders argued that her skills were too valuable to lose, that she represented institutional knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced. Fellow soldiers expressed disbelief that she would consider leaving, asking where she would find the same sense of purpose, the same intensity of experience, the same brotherhood that only combat creates. Parker Wu made her choice with the same quiet certainty that had guided every major decision in her life. She chose to leave military service behind, to walk away from the identity she had built over years of deployments, from the call sign that had become more real than her given name, from the brotherhood of soldiers who understood her in ways civilians never could. The decision wasn't easy, wasn't made lightly, but it was made with clear eyes and full acceptance of what it meant. She had given enough years to war. Now she wanted to give her skills to peace. The transition was strange and disorienting. She left behind the structure of military life, the clear hierarchy, the defined missions with measurable outcomes. She traded her rifle for hospital scrubs, her body armor for latex gloves, her combat boots for comfortable shoes designed for 12-hour shifts on sterile floors. The battlefield became operating rooms and emergency departments. The explosions and gunfire were replaced by the controlled chaos of trauma bays and code blues. But the fundamental work remained the same, keeping people alive when their bodies were determined to fail. She took a position at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, the massive military hospital in Germany that served as the primary medical facility for wounded service members evacuated from combat zones throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. It was a deliberate choice, a way to remain connected to the military community while stepping back from direct combat operations. Here she could use her skills to heal veterans, to understand their wounds with an intimacy born from having treated similar injuries under fire, to be a bridge between the world of combat medicine and the world of definitive surgical care. Parker entered the civilian nursing structure at a level far below what her experience warranted. Her combat medical training didn't translate directly into nursing credentials, despite being more comprehensive than most nursing programs. She completed accelerated training programs, earned her certifications, and accepted assignments that placed her alongside nurses fresh from school who had never seen trauma beyond what they encountered in controlled clinical rotations. She never spoke of her military service unless directly asked, never mentioned the call sign that still followed her in whispered conversations among the veterans she treated, never claimed status or demanded recognition based on what she had done before. Her colleagues knew her only as Parker, a competent nurse who seemed unusually calm during emergencies, who had steady hands and good clinical judgment, who could start 4 lines that other nurses struggled with, who seemed to anticipate complications before monitors could alert them. To most of the hospital staff, she was unremarkable, quiet, professional, competent, but not exceptional. Just another nurse in a system full of nurses, all working long hours under difficult conditions to care for wounded soldiers far from home. But the veterans recognized her. Not always immediately, not always consciously, but something in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she understood their experiences without them having to explain, marked her as different. A soldier recovering from blast injuries might catch her eye and sense familiarity, a shared knowledge that transcended words. A Marine dealing with traumatic amputation might find comfort in her presence that went beyond standard nursing care. They couldn't always articulate what set her apart, but they felt it in the same way soldiers in combat zones had felt safer knowing Phantom was nearby. Parker never confirmed their suspicions. When veterans asked if she had served, she offered vague affirmations that satisfied curiosity without revealing details. Yes, she had been deployed. Yes, she understood what they were going through. No, she didn't want to talk about her experiences. The past was sealed away, classified both officially and personally. She had chosen a new path, and dwelling on what came before served no purpose beyond feeding a nostalgia that could trap her in memories of a life she had deliberately left behind. The work at Landstuhl was demanding but different from combat medicine. Here she had resources, equipment, backup, specialists who could be consulted for complex cases. The decisions weren't made in isolation under fire, but collaboratively in well-lit rooms with multiple experts contributing their knowledge. Lives were still saved, but the margin between success and failure was wider, the opportunities for intervention more numerous, the support systems more robust. It should have felt easier, But sometimes Parker found herself missing the clarity of combat medicine, the absolute focus required when you were the only medical asset available and failure meant immediate death. She had been working at Landstuhl for 18 months when Justice Reed arrived on her shift, another wounded SEAL among hundreds of wounded soldiers she had treated since transitioning to nursing. She had no way of knowing that his arrival would shatter the careful separation she had maintained between her past and present. No way of anticipating that a single whispered word from a dying man would expose the identity she had worked so hard to leave behind. No way of predicting that Dr. Morgan Rivera's dismissive arrogance would force her to choose between maintaining her anonymity and saving a life that hung by the thinnest of threads. The story returned to the present, to the aftermath of an impossible surgery that had tested everyone in that operating room and revealed truths that some would have preferred remained hidden. Dr. Morgan Rivera sat alone in the surgeon's lounge hours after Justice Reed had been transferred to intensive care. The room was quiet, empty except for him and the weight of his thoughts. A cup of coffee cooled on the table before him, untouched, forgotten in the mental replay of everything that had transpired during those 8 hours of surgical crisis. His earlier arrogance haunted him with uncomfortable clarity. "You're only a nurse. Stay out of the way." The words echoed in his memory, each syllable a small violence against someone who had deserved better. He had reduced Parker Wu to a category, dismissed her based on rank and title without bothering to see the person beneath the uniform. He had assumed competence followed hierarchy, that his medical degree and surgical training automatically placed him above someone whose credentials appeared less impressive on paper. And he had been catastrophically wrong. Rivera thought about the moment when Justice Reed had whispered that call sign, when the operating room had fallen silent, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something beyond routine medical care. He thought about Parker's hands moving with absolute certainty, about the orders she had given that saved a life he had been losing, about the way she had commanded the room without raising her voice or demanding obedience. She had led through pure competence, through demonstrated mastery that made argument impossible and resistance futile. The other members of the surgical team had discussed what happened, their conversations spreading through the hospital with the speed that significant events always traveled in close communities. Phoenix Grant had called it the most extraordinary trauma response he had witnessed in 20 years of anesthesiology. Avery Mason told anyone who would listen about the nurse who performed like a surgeon, who knew procedures that required years of specialized training, who moved through the crisis with the calm of someone who had faced worse and survived. Finley Ross simply said that Parker Wu had saved Justice Reed's life and left it at that, the stark simplicity of the statement carrying more weight than elaborate praise. Rivera understood now that he had failed in ways that extended beyond his treatment of Parker. He had failed as a teacher by not recognizing excellence when it stood beside him. He had failed as a leader by allowing pride to blind him to the capabilities of his team. He had failed as a physician by forgetting that healing required humility, that the best medical care often came from collaboration rather than hierarchy, that saving lives mattered more than preserving ego. The lesson was harsh but necessary, delivered with the uncompromising clarity that only near disaster can provide. His transformation had already begun, visible to those who worked with him regularly. The dismissive edge that had characterized his interactions with nurses and junior staff had softened, replaced by genuine consultation and respect. He asked questions instead of issuing commands, listened to concerns instead of overriding them with surgical authority, acknowledged expertise regardless of where it originated. The change wasn't performative or strategic, but fundamental, rooted in the bone-deep understanding that his previous approach had nearly cost a man his life. Other surgeons noticed the shift and asked what had changed him. Rivera shared the story carefully, protecting Parker's privacy while conveying the essential lesson. He spoke about a nurse who had proven herself under impossible conditions, who had possessed skills and knowledge that exceeded his own in critical moments, who had taught him that true mastery often wore humble clothing. Some surgeons understood immediately, recognizing their own blind spots reflected in his experience. Others dismissed it as an anomaly, maintaining their hierarchical worldview despite evidence that it was flawed and potentially dangerous. The hospital culture began to shift incrementally, pushed forward by Rivera's example and the story that spread through departments and shifts. Nurses reported feeling heard in ways they hadn't before. Junior staff found their observations taken seriously rather than dismissed. The rigid hierarchy that had characterized medical decision-making loosened slightly, creating space for collaboration that improved patient outcomes and reduced errors born from unchallenged authority. The changes were small, sometimes barely perceptible, but they accumulated like snowfall, each flake insignificant alone but transformative in aggregate. Parker Wu continued her work unchanged by the recognition that now followed her through hospital corridors. She remained quiet, professional, competent, declining opportunities to discuss what had happened in that operating room. When colleagues asked about her military service, she deflected with practiced ease. When veterans tried to confirm suspicions about her identity, she neither confirmed nor denied, maintaining the separation between past and present that she had carefully constructed. Her focus remained singular, providing the best possible care to patients who needed her skills, nothing more, nothing less. Rivera watched her from a distance, seeing clearly now what he had missed before. The economy of her movements, the depth of her knowledge, the calm that never broke regardless of circumstances. He wondered how many others like her worked throughout the medical system, their extraordinary capabilities hidden beneath ordinary titles, their expertise unrecognized because it didn't conform to expected patterns. He wondered how many lives could be saved if leaders learned to look past credentials and hierarchy to see the actual competence of the people around them. Weeks passed in the measured rhythm of hospital recovery. Justice Reed moved through the stages of healing that doctors had privately doubted he would reach. The shrapnel wounds that should have killed him closed slowly, tissue knitting together under the careful attention of surgical teams who checked his progress daily. His vitals stabilized into ranges that promised not just survival, but eventual return to full function. The infection that had threatened during his second week never materialized, held at bay by aggressive antibiotic protocols and the stubborn constitution of a man who had survived worse odds in worse places. He regained full consciousness gradually, emerging from sedation like a diver ascending from deep water. The first days were fragmented, memory and reality blurring together in morphine-soaked confusion. He remembered firefight, remembered the specific instant when shrapnel had torn through his body, remembered being loaded onto a helicopter while voices shouted urgently around him. But the details of what came after existed only in disconnected impressions. Bright lights, urgent voices, hands pressing against his wounds, and a presence that felt familiar in ways he couldn't quite articulate. By his third week at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Justice Reed was alert enough to ask coherent questions. The medical staff answered what they could, explaining the extent of his injuries, the complexity of his surgery that had saved him, the long recovery that still lay ahead. They told him about Dr. Morgan Rivera's skilled work, about the surgical team that had fought for 8 hours to stabilize him, about the multiple complications that could have killed him but didn't. But they said nothing about the nurse who had guided them through it all, either because they hadn't been told or because they understood that some stories belonged to the people who lived them. Reed knew better. He had been in and out of consciousness during the surgery, his awareness flickering like a failing light, but he remembered fragments with crystalline clarity. He remembered a voice, calm and absolutely certain, giving orders that others followed without question. He remembered hands that moved with practiced efficiency, pressure applied at exact points that his combat medical training recognized as textbook perfect. Most importantly, he remembered a presence that triggered recognition buried deep in his soldier's memory, a sense of having been saved by these same hands before in another place, another crisis. When a young nurse came to check his vitals during an evening shift, Reed gathered his strength and asked the question that had been building since he regained consciousness. The nurse who was in the operating room when they brought me in, he said, his voice still rough from the endotracheal tube that had breathed for him during surgery. Dark hair, quiet, maybe late 20s. Is she still working here? The young nurse's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been understanding or caution. She paused in her work, considering her response carefully. There were several nurses in your surgery, she said finally. The operating room staff rotates through many procedures. Do you remember a name? Reed shook his head slowly, the movement causing pain despite medication. No name, he admitted. Just a presence. A certainty, like someone who had done this before in much worse conditions. The young nurse finished recording his blood pressure, her movements deliberate and professional. She met his eyes with an expression that conveyed both sympathy and boundary. Some of our nurses have extensive experience, she said carefully. Military backgrounds, previous deployments. They bring that expertise to their work here. Did she save me? Reed asked directly. The question hung between them, loaded with meaning that extended beyond medical intervention. The young nurse offered a soft smile, but said nothing, her silence more eloquent than any confirmation could have been. She adjusted his foreline, checked his medication pump, and prepared to leave the room. Before she reached the door, Reed spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of certainty born from years of combat experience. It was phantom, wasn't it? She was there. The nurse paused with her hand on the door handle, her back to him. When she turned, her expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. Some truths are best kept quiet, she said gently. Some people prefer their past to remain separate from their present. If someone saved your life, the best way to honor that might be to respect their privacy. Reed understood the message beneath her words. He had his answer, not in confirmation, but in careful deflection that told him everything he needed to know. He closed his eyes, memories flooding back with new context and meaning. Afghanistan, 3 years earlier, a village raid that had gone catastrophically wrong. He had taken rounds through his vest, felt ribs crack, felt lung tissue tear, felt the certainty of death settling over him like a blanket. And then hands had appeared, steady and sure, speaking calm instructions while bullets cracked overhead. A combat medic whose call sign he had heard, but whose face he had never clearly seen through the haze of pain and shock. Phantom, the medic who moved through firefights like smoke, who appeared where casualties were worst, who brought soldiers back from edges that should have claimed them. She had saved him before, in that Afghan village where he should have bled out in the dirt. And she had saved him again in a German operating room where he should have died on steel and sterile draping. The same hands, the same certainty, the same absolute refusal to accept death as inevitable. Reed felt gratitude so profound it bordered on religious, a debt that could never be adequately repaid but would be carried forever. Dr. Morgan Rivera's transformation continued through the months following Justice Reed's surgery, deepening from initial realization into fundamental change that affected every aspect of his medical practice. The arrogance that had once defined his surgical approach dissolved, replaced by humility that made him more effective rather than less. He no longer entered operating rooms with the assumption that his perspective was automatically superior, that his decisions were beyond question, that his authority derived from title rather than earned through collaborative excellence. The shift was noticed by everyone who worked with him regularly. Nurses who had once dreaded being assigned to Rivera's surgical teams now volunteered for his cases. They found him willing to listen to their observations, to incorporate their expertise into decision-making processes, to acknowledge when their knowledge exceeded his own in specific areas. The operating room culture he created became collaborative rather than hierarchical, building on the strengths of every team member instead of relying solely on the surgeon's judgment. Patient outcomes improved measurably, complications decreased, and the satisfaction scores from both staff and patients reflected the positive changes. Other surgeons observed Rivera's evolution with varying reactions. Some recognized the wisdom in his approach and began implementing similar changes in their own practice. They started asking nurses for input during procedures, soliciting feedback from junior staff, acknowledging the limitations of their own knowledge. These surgeons found that admitting uncertainty didn't diminish their authority, but strengthened it. That collaboration produced better results than autocracy, that the best medical care emerged from teams where every voice could be heard and respected. But others dismissed Rivera's transformation as weakness, as an overcorrection born from a single unusual experience. They maintained their hierarchical approach, insisting that surgical authority required clear command structures and unquestioned decision-making. They argued that operating rooms needed decisive leadership, not democratic consensus, that surgeons bore ultimate responsibility and therefore deserved ultimate control. Rivera didn't argue with them, didn't try to convert them through debate. He simply continued his work, letting results speak louder than rhetoric. The hospital administration took notice of the cultural shifts spreading through surgical departments. Patient satisfaction scores climbed. Staff retention improved as nurses felt more valued and respected. Medical errors decreased as team members felt empowered to speak up about concerns without fear of dismissal or retribution. The changes couldn't be attributed to any single factor, but the pattern suggested that Rivera's approach was producing measurable benefits that extended beyond his own operating room. Rivera himself rarely spoke about what had prompted his transformation. When asked directly, he would acknowledge that he had learned an important lesson about recognizing excellence regardless of where it appeared, about the dangers of assumption and prejudice, about the necessity of humility in a profession where lives hung in the balance. He never named Parker Wu specifically, respecting her clear preference for privacy, but those who had been present during Justice Reed's surgery understood the source of his awakening. The message Rivera tried to convey extended beyond medicine into broader questions about how societies valued different types of expertise, how hierarchies could blind people to talent that didn't fit expected patterns, how assumptions about gender, rank, and credentials could prevent recognition of genuine mastery. He understood now that Parker Wu's situation wasn't unique, that medical systems everywhere likely employed people whose capabilities far exceeded their official positions, whose expertise went unrecognized because it didn't conform to standard career trajectories. He wondered how many lives could be saved if leaders across all fields learned to look past titles and credentials to see actual competence. How many innovations were being missed because the people proposing them didn't have the right degrees or positions? How many problems remained unsolved because the people with solutions didn't have sufficient authority to be heard? The questions haunted him, driving changes that extended beyond his own practice into advocacy for broader institutional reforms. Parker Wu remained the quiet center around which these transformations orbited, unchanged by the recognition that now followed her through hospital corridors. She continued her nursing work with the same dedication she had always shown, treating veterans who arrived at Landstuhl with injuries ranging from minor to catastrophic. She never spoke of what had happened in that operating room with Justice Reed, never claimed credit for the life she had saved or the cultural changes her actions had inspired. When colleagues tried to discuss it, she deflected with practiced ease, redirecting conversations toward patient care and away from personal history. But veterans recognized her still, their soldiers' instincts identifying something that transcended uniform and rank. They found comfort in her presence that went beyond standard nursing care, a sense that they were being watched over by someone who understood combat in ways that couldn't be taught in medical school. They felt safer with her on their care team, not because of anything she said or claimed, but because of something they sensed in her movements, her voice, her absolute certainty when crisis struck. The legend of Phantom persisted in whispered conversations, in stories passed between recovering soldiers, in a mythology that grew despite Parker's determined efforts to remain invisible within it. The story of Parker Wu remained half-remembered, half-spoken, passed down in fragments and whispers through the corridors of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center and beyond. Soldiers still spoke of her in hushed tones when they gathered in recovery wards, sharing stories about the nurse who seemed to understand combat medicine at levels that transcended standard training. Some claim she had saved entire units during her deployment years, appearing in impossible places at critical moments. Others said she had once held a defensive line alone while treating casualties under sustained enemy fire. The truth, as always, was simpler and far more powerful than the mythology that surrounded it. She had saved lives again and again without hesitation, not because of glory or recognition, not because of rank or ambition, but because it was fundamentally who she was. A healer who operated with absolute commitment regardless of circumstances, who brought the same dedication to civilian nursing that she had once brought to combat medicine, who refused to accept death as inevitable when skill and determination might tip the balance toward life. Her military service had forged her capabilities, but her essential nature predated any uniform or deployment. She was someone who ran toward crisis while others sought safety, who carried others' burdens without complaint, who found purpose in service rather than acclaim. In the sterile light of hospital operating rooms and recovery wards, Parker Wu reminded everyone who witnessed her work that true strength didn't need titles or announcements. Surgeons, nurses, administrators, patients, all learned through her example that the most profound competence often wore humble clothing, that mastery could exist without demanding recognition, that heroism didn't require fanfare or celebration. Dr. Morgan Rivera carried this lesson forward in every surgery he performed, every team he led, every interaction with staff who society might dismiss as less important than surgeons. The cultural changes that began with Justice Reed's surgery continued spreading through Landstuhl and beyond. Medical facilities throughout the military healthcare system heard about the nurse who had saved a SEAL through extraordinary skill, about the surgeon who had learned humility through near-catastrophic failure, about the operating room, where hierarchy had dissolved in favor of collaborative excellence. Some hospitals implemented formal changes to encourage input from all staff levels. Others simply found that attitudes shifted incrementally as the story circulated, planting seeds of doubt about rigid hierarchies and assumptions about who possessed expertise worth respecting. Parker continued her work unchanged by the recognition that followed her like a shadow. She treated wounded soldiers with the same care she had always provided, drawing on years of experience without claiming credit for what that experience represented. When new nurses asked for her guidance, she shared knowledge freely, teaching not just technical skills, but the mindset required to function under pressure, to maintain clarity during chaos, to prioritize effectively when multiple patients needed immediate intervention. She trained the next generation quietly, passing forward capabilities that might save lives in future crises she would never witness. Justice Reed recovered fully, eventually returning to active duty with his SEAL team. Before he left Landstuhl, he tried once more to speak with Parker to express gratitude that words couldn't adequately convey. She declined the meeting through intermediaries, maintaining the boundary between her past and present that she had carefully constructed. But she sent a brief message through the young nurse who had deflected his questions weeks earlier. "Tell him I'm glad he's going home to his family. Tell him that's payment enough for anything I might have done. Tell him to stay safe out there." The message reached Reed as he prepared to board his flight back to the United States. He stood on the tarmac at Ramstein Air Base, reading the words multiple times, understanding what they meant and what they didn't say. She had saved him twice, in 2 different wars, under 2 different sets of impossible circumstances, and she wanted nothing in return except his survival and safe return to the people who loved him. It was the most profound gift he had ever received, given by someone who refused to accept recognition for giving it. Years would pass, and the story would continue evolving, details shifting with each retelling until legend and truth became impossible to separate. But certain elements remained constant through all versions. There had been a combat medic named Phantom who had operated at levels of excellence that defied conventional understanding. She had saved lives in places where death seemed certain, bringing wounded soldiers home when logistics and probability suggested they should have been left behind. And when her military service ended, she had chosen to continue healing in civilian contexts, trading combat zones for hospital corridors, but maintaining the same absolute commitment to preserving life. Parker Wu walked through Landstuhl on a quiet evening shift, checking on patients who slept fitfully in recovery rooms, adjusting 4 lines and medication dosages, offering comfort to those whose wounds went beyond physical damage. She moved with the same economy of motion that had characterized her combat medicine, the same focused calm that had guided her through hundreds of crises. To casual observers, she appeared unremarkable, just a nurse completing routine tasks at the end of another long shift. But there was no such thing as only a nurse, no such thing as ordinary service, no such thing as simple dedication to healing. True heroism, Parker had learned through years of experience, didn't demand attention or require recognition. It showed up consistently, performed its duties with excellence, and found satisfaction in outcomes rather than accolades. Sometimes the greatest warriors were the ones society dismissed as ordinary, the quiet professionals who saved lives without seeking credit, the dedicated healers who brought light into darkness not through dramatic gestures, but through sustained competence applied with absolute commitment. And that truth, Parker Wu knew, with certainty born from living it, was more than fine with her. Thank you for watching States of History. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps keep these powerful stories alive for the world to hear.